everyone. I just want to remind you guys that the webinar will be recorded and posted later, and for everyone that's joining us live, to please make sure to send your questions to the Q&A function throughout the presentation for afterwards. So our speaker today, Erum Agha, holds a PhD in social work and is currently a postdoc research fellow at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill School of Medicine. Her research and service interests are on culturally relevant interventions for the behavioral health needs of resettled refugees, particularly refugee women who may be living with undiagnosed and untreated trauma. When left unaddressed, this may impact the outcomes for children in the context of school, as well as social and interpersonal functioning. For Erum's research, she is currently examining the use of alternative models of health and healing for optimized outcomes for resettled refugee women and their families in community settings. Her experience includes extensive practice with refugees in resettlement, research, and clinical settings. So today we are so fortunate to have her come speak for us. So welcome, Erum.
Thank you, Shada. Thank you for inviting me to speak during this webinar series, and also thank you so much for the introduction. I also want to thank the participants for being here for my presentation. I will now begin my screen share. Please give me a moment. There we go. My presentation is entitled Inclusion of Resettled Refugee Women in Conversations about Their Health and Behavioral Health Needs. This slide contains pictures from United Nations camps and settlements located in various regions of the world. It is not known whether the women depicted in the pictures have been given resettlement as of yet, or they're still waiting. This is the reason and motivation for my research, which is women and children from refugee backgrounds reaching their full potential in their lives at homes, schools, work, and communities. We know that the direct impact of trauma, maternal trauma, on children and families is a serious global health problem and warrants our full attention and immediate attention. We are all aware of the current refugee crisis, with more than 71 million forcibly displaced individuals globally, including 26 million refugees, 41 million of those who are internally displaced within their own countries, and another 4 million asylum seekers. And we are also aware of the refugees' perilous journeys through the pre-migration stages, which begins in their home when the conflict arises, and then in transits, which is intended to be temporary, and then post-migration stages. In every stage, there may be exposure to trauma, torture, and violence, whether direct or indirect, and then there are ongoing stressors after resettlement. This combined effect of pre-migration trauma and post-migration stressors takes a toll on personal and family levels. For context, I would like to share that we have approximately 3.3 million refugees resettled here in the United States. The list of factors that make refugee women vulnerable is long, and the risks may be due to marginalization because of gender, patriarchal norms, of course, low education, literacy, and poverty. And then a lot of women often are subjected to early marriages, end up having large families and large family responsibilities, and then exposure to gender-based violence. There are negative outcomes for health as well as behavioral health for refugee women based on these risk factors. The consequences of the trauma on refugee women's behavioral health could be on individual levels, on family level, and children level. And at the individual level, it could mean that their health is compromised. It reduces their psychosocial functioning, which reduces the financial stability. At the family level, there could be communication problems, dysfunction, and instability. And all of these could have a negative impact on children at schools, homes, communities, and of course, that leads to intergenerational trauma. This is also like looking at the ecosystems, micro, meso, exo, and chronosystems. There are some gaps that exist in literature, and my research has also identified those gaps. The first and the biggest one is that refugees are often reported as homogeneous groups. What this means is that refugees are presented as one unit, which could include male and female refugees. Sometimes it may include refugees that are adolescents and children within the same group. Refugees from rural and urban backgrounds could be presented as one unit. And also those with different needs, unique needs, or those with disabilities are often not reported separately, and that is a problem. There are also gaps in our understanding of comprehensive factors related to the behavioral health. And then the challenges. So barriers and challenges are often confounded. It is important to know that barriers lead to challenges. Another important gap is that perhaps it is easier to reach the service providers compared with the refugee population. So more studies report on the providers' perspectives and fewer on the voices of refugee participants. And then there are even fewer studies that seek the perspectives of both the providers and the participants within a single study. The lack of studies reporting culturally appropriate ways to examine behavioral health are few, but there are actually few studies that report creating and developing and evaluating those culturally appropriate measures. So my research begins to address these gaps through a qualitative study using culturally appropriate approach to seek the perspectives of refugee women as well as service providers. My research builds on existing research, and I will now present some of the methodology and findings from my result, in which I interviewed women from Syria and then their service providers. I chose Syria because the Syrian population is the largest part of the refugee population right now at 6.8 million, and the conflict escalated very quickly. Physical safety and emergency needs took precedence. Thus, there are gaps in our understanding of behavioral health needs among the resettled refugee women from Syria. I consulted with experts on research, behavioral health, and resettlement to confirm this choice, and then I was given a go-ahead with it. This work is grounded in theoretical foundations. Of course, we know that whenever a new phenomena is being examined, a qualitative approach is the best approach, which could be used on its own or in conjunction with quantitative methods. Here, this was a qualitative study, and I used two theoretical frameworks that I deemed were most appropriate for this study. The first one was the ecological model of refugee distress, which considers both the pre-migration and post-migration factors to examine distress. And it uses an ecological rather than a clinical perspective, meaning not trying to diagnose a refugee as presenting with certain illnesses or issues with health, rather seeing the complex interplay of biological, psychological, social, economic, and political forces, which again could be the micro, meso, exo, macro, and chrono systems. And it also describes the risk factors for mental health of individuals displaced due to war or conflict. The second frame that I used for this study was a medical anthropology framework. I did some searching for frameworks, and based on what was available, this seemed the second most appropriate. This framework explains how health and illness are shaped in the context of historical, global, and political forces, and that also how individual experiences are shaped by rituals and belief systems. Now, we have to understand that these concepts of rituals, beliefs, and historical and global forces, although important, are not always captured or adequately captured in the Western medical systems. The theoretical frameworks also informed the development of the interview questionnaires and also helped understand and analyze the responses from the participants. There's a lot of information on this slide, but this is the entire methodology for this whole study. I had a total of 5 research questions that guided my study. I reserved 3 of those questions for the Syrian women and the 2 to guide their interview process for the providers. What I did was I developed a semi-structured interview guide with 11 open-ended questions to be presented to the providers. But for the Syrian women, instead of just asking them direct questions, I created culturally relevant vignettes with used characters similar to themselves, depicting their own culture and background and situations, and just to begin a conversation with them. That method was found to be engaging. The women appreciated not being asked direct questions about their own health and behavioral health. And we got very good responses using that methodology. I had a total of 21 participants, and among those were 14 women from Syria, and their ages were between 20 to 55 years. The average of the time in the United States was 2 to 3 years, and they had between 0 and 9 children. Their education ranged from no formal education to a college degree, and past professions included homemakers for 10 of them. There were 2 teachers, one of them was self-employed, and 2 students. For the service providers, there were 7 of them, and the time spent in resettlement, again, there was a large range here from 3 to 26 years. They were all females. So we have to bear in mind that the perspectives, which we will see later, of the male providers may have been different. None of the providers reported being a refugee previously, and they included case managers, employment specialists, immigration coordinators, policy level administrators, and behavioral health therapists. So I used the DSM-5, which is a clinical diagnostic manual, to create vignettes that probed women's understanding of various mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And for social and cultural issues, I used cultural knowledge and consults from expertise working with refugees. I am myself a clinician, and I have also spent a significant amount of time in resettlement. And I am a researcher. So those were some of the strengths when developing this study. For the service providers, the questions were open-ended, as I have indicated before. So the data was analyzed in a very rigorous manner. The data were collected in North Carolina. In the United States, there were 6 initiation points. Verbal consent was obtained. I voice recorded and then transcribed each interview verbatim. I conducted the entire process myself. Data were stored in a very safe location. And there were some challenges encountered in screening and recruiting. Of course, there were no examples for this group of population, that is Syrian women resettled in North Carolina. And we overcome those challenges in recruiting in women's only settings, and then also involving family members as part of the hiring recruiting process, and then conducting the interviews in the women's homes. I conducted several rounds of coding and triangulation with 2 other researchers for the transcripts, and established dependability, confirmability, transferability, which were criteria for rigorous qualitative research. I also reported the findings using the COREC criteria to establish further rigor. So on the screen here, we see a number of words, and they're standalone words. What this is these are the actual words spoken by the Syrian women during the interviews. And there was a broad range of responses which were coded and then grouped into themes. And each time the word appeared, we numbered it. The larger size indicates that the word was repeated often. So for example, women talked about being sad, they talked about missing their friends or family, talked about being scared or nervous. English was mentioned a lot. Syria was missed and mentioned a lot, talked about life. And then there are other words that are smaller, which were also mentioned, but they weren't mentioned as much. The use of thematic analysis was deemed most appropriate for this study. Data were coded, and then the codes were grouped into themes. Many important themes emerged, and the most important themes I have reported here. So for the women, I've highlighted the themes that emerged from women's responses. So trauma was indicated by responses that revealed some kind of emotional avoidance or denial or grief, and it was a most prominent theme in the interviews. There were barriers that were reported, which included language issues, transportation, and then the stigma related to health and behavioral health needs. And then challenges were reported, meaning lack of employment or difficulty in seeking and retaining employment, social isolation from others, reduced family functioning. So here we can see that, as I mentioned earlier, there is a difference between barriers and challenges, and the challenges seem to emerge from the barriers. And this is also another difference that I have identified using this study. Women reported a number of alternate coping strategies, including going to parks, friends, watching television, and listening to music, getting involved in housework, and resorting to religious rituals. There were important themes that were seen from provider interviews also, as we can see that providers talked about culturally competent services. They wanted to recognize women's own expertise and promoting agency, and then also discussed alternate approaches to treatment of behavioral health problems. There was a need for privacy and avoiding stigma that was observed in the responses of the women. And it was also very obvious that the women did not have the context for behavioral health as we do in the Western system of medicine. The responses from the women were supported by the theories that I have selected, and also the responses from the providers were supported by the theories selected. I will leave this slide up for a moment here. These are some of the actual responses from the women. No identifying information was collected or retained, and the responses were coded, so there is no way to identify the women looking at these. And we can see that the responses that are indicative of grief, denial, and emotional avoidance appear in the top section, and then alternative strategies for coping, such as I don't like medicine. If I feel anything, I make coffee, I watch TV, I read Quran. And then of course, barriers and challenges are reported. For example, if you see under barriers, my first participant says that it is very hard. We becoming refugees, different life, different language. Language is the problem, big problem. We go to work, we don't have the language, the manager out us. This is a very rich quote, and not only talks about barriers, it's also talking about the challenges. So there was no good way to keep it into one or the other category, but I think it says this answers a lot of my research questions. Here I have taken just two responses from the providers, and the first one talks about cultural competence, and the second one talks about promoting agencies. Of course, we know that these are the best approaches that would highlight the very skills of the persons that we're serving, and they also are supported by the frameworks that I have selected for this study. So as with any study, it is important to look at the results in light of its limitations. Of course, the sample was small, but as is the case with all qualitative studies, the sample was also limited to English-speaking women from Syria, and the perspectives of those who did not speak English could have been different. The findings are not generalizable, and that's not what we were seeking to do. This was a new phenomena, and we were going to explore it in a small setting. The sample was limited to selected areas of North Carolina, and again, this was the study wanted to examine the health and behavioral health needs of this marginalized population within North Carolina. However, the study made several contributions, first of all, by beginning to fill gaps in our understanding of the health and behavioral health needs of Syrian women, and demonstrated a novel and engaging way of having discussions about health and behavioral health with Syrian women using culturally relevant vignettes, each of which was developed specifically for this study. We conclude that the Syrian women must be provided with a context for behavioral health prior to engaging them in a discussion for those needs. And then also there is a big need for culturally relevant interventions for the women and their families. So, as is the focus of today's webinar, bringing together research and service and advocacy, how do we do that? Well, we have to be inclusive in advocacy by starting with researcher, of course, because I'm a researcher and presenting my research here. Research needs to be actionable. What that means is that it should look at advocacy as an intervention and be actionable. That is something that improves the human condition at a large scale, and research has the capacity to do that. Then talking about the service piece, that we have to create through service a systemic change by creating systemic social justice, and then recognizing differences. This is very important, that recognizing that the diverse groups within the refugee populations are not homogeneous, and before we start developing solutions, we must look at all factors, whether those are cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, all doing so while maintaining ethics and recognizing our own privilege, biases, and being reflexive every step of the way. Of course, centering the voices and experiences of refugees is at the crux of advocacy. So that we are not advocating for refugees only, but we are advocating with them and including them every step of the way to present their strengths, because they have many strengths, and their needs, because they are best able to present their needs. And then finally, collaborations and partnerships, because research, service, practice, and policy cannot be siloed, and some of the greatest goals can be achieved with the right collaboration, specifically for humanitarian organizations who are on the front lines. They can benefit from the roles of other groups, as was also given in the social change ecosystem, which was provided in part of the curricula that was attached as for this webinar. And of course, we can always add more actors and more allies to that eco map on who is most suitable for those partnerships and who could be a right ally. And then finally, looking at the big picture, we have to look at the larger context for advocacy, meaning that it is rooted in social justice and fights oppression and marginalization, recognizing the expertise and recognizing the ability to contribute of the refugee communities, thus giving them a sense of belonging, having welcoming communities of research, practice, service providers, and allies, and education, because knowledge is power, and not just the book knowledge, but the knowledge whether it is given through education, skill development, literacy, or health literacy. Those are some of the very important things that we must cover and capture if we are to do the ethical advocacy along with refugees. These are some of the references that I used in this presentation. This concludes my presentation. I will be happy to answer any questions that any participants may have.
Thank you so much. That was super informative. And I think it was really special that like some of the other presentations we've got have sort of broken down theory, but that this was actually based off of a sample of women that you talked with directly. So it's very authentic and legitimate responses. So this was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
It was also very recent. Just the study is very recent. It is, part of it is published and part of it is under review. So yeah.
Amazing. So to our participants, if you guys want to put your questions in the Q&A function, then I will read those aloud and we can kind of engage with those. But while you guys are thinking about that, I have a couple of questions that I came up with
Sure.
that you can kind of ask. So first, this is a bit long-winded, but based on the feedback from the sample of women that you spoke with, how can and should policy increasingly incorporate the perspectives of refugee women, and also while recognizing the differences that you mentioned, instead of mostly or just what service providers say. So I guess sort of like illustrating exactly what that collaboration piece that you talked about would look like.
Yes, thank you. This is a very important question. I think this was not the first study that I conducted with resettled women. And based on my experience, if we are reaching out to the right folks who are really serving refugees through either their service or their research, there will be some alignment in the responses. So for example, as was visible from the responses that I had shared, that the women were talking about their needs, but however, the providers were not saying anything that was contrary to those, meaning they were recognizing that the women were, in my case of my study, that the women were the most expert regarding their own needs and health and what the next steps should be. And I think the right partnership would involve both. And of course, because there is a big piece of cultural understanding and knowledge of, one cannot have an understanding of every single culture that the refugees may be coming from. There are more than 300 different cultures represented, of course, that we know that are recorded in literature. So to have the cultural humility and saying, okay, I'm not aware, or this is the first time that I'm recognizing, and then incorporating those, and then having some cultural mediators, cultural experts. So maybe we could have some refugees who have been resettled for a number of years, so who have been on both sides, who have been a service recipient at some point, and who may be a service provider. In my previous study, 2 of my service providers were previous refugees, and they were now in a position that they were providing services to the new coming refugees. So I would consider some kind of a brokerage from people who have expertise, who are bringing the refugee perspective and translating into terms that are more understandable by persons in the Western side of the world and trying to provide services. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so having all voices at the table, not just the Western voice making the decisions for somebody else, but to actually hear and include those voices.
Yes, precisely. Thank you.
Great. So the next question. So first of all, yes, the PowerPoint, we can share that with you guys alone. Erum sent it to me, but the question is, what is the name of the publication that you're working on? And thank you for your time to share your research.
Yeah, the first one, because it was, and it is related also to the question from one of the participants, it was challenging to recruit the participants, because the first time I screened was within the resettlement setting. And then a lot of times when women were present in front of their families, they either were shy to express an interest in being recruited for the study, or sometimes they did not feel comfortable speaking English because they may be, they may have learned English after their arrival here. So one of the requirements for participating in the study was having fair to good English. And I had 2 participants with really fluent English, and everybody else was fair English, because I wanted them to be able to understand the questions and then be able to provide answers. So that means that I was limited to much fewer women, because I was only seeking participants from North Carolina. And because this was a different process, and when I searched literature, I did not see any methodology on what to do in cases like that. And then also, then I did a double screening method. So for example, instead of just reaching out to women, first I reached out to the women in the agency setting. That didn't work if it was in front of the families. Then I reached out to the families. So once the women had expressed an interest in participating in the study, I then communicated with the husbands, for example, and I shared what the study was about, and I asked if they would be comfortable in their wives participating in the study, and each one of them agreed. And I was invited into their homes to conduct the interviews. And then once there was a consent and agreement from the family, I then again sought consent from the women, so that they don't feel pressurized. So I sought a double consent process. This is the first time that I have not seen this in literature. And so this was a new strategy that I used, and I reported it separately, and it's accepted for publication. It should be coming out soon in the Journal of Refugee Studies. And it is reported as such methodology of recruitment. So this, and then the study was so large in scope, where one would be surprised with 21 participants. However, the data was so rich that I had to split the study into 3 separate studies, and those are currently under preparation for submission.
Awesome. So the next question that I have that I was really happy to see, and it's not often that I've seen in this type of research, but I guess kind of, do you think that a lot of people or researchers who are trying to truly authentically analyze refugee experiences in the resettlement process should be incorporating, I guess in terms of like the behavioral health field, but the medical anthropological approach, because then it gains access to the cultural insight to that, to have a better understanding and capture the situation instead of just the status quo or quantitative research. And so how can we sort of promote this type of research that is more holistic and I guess uses that medical anthropological approach?
Yeah. So can you break it down for me again?
Yeah, I guess just like if you could speak a little bit to the benefits of using that type of approach, the medical anthropological one, and kind of contrasting that with just using quantitative research collection, and then how to further promote that with the benefits that it comes with throughout research.
You know, when I was seeking frameworks, it was a long process. So I looked at psychology, and there were frameworks on, traumatic recovery. There were frameworks on post-traumatic growth. Then I looked at all of that. There were frameworks on marginalization, and that wasn't the scope because I'm trying to promote and talk about the refugee strengths. So what I did and what I was advised to do was to look into something about culture, right? So we have to recognize the diversity and richness of different cultures. And the medical anthropology was my choice because, first of all, in the past, when people had an ailment, they went to their local healer or the local service provider who understood what the needs of the certain village or city were, and then what the factors were, if there was some kind of a disease that was prevalent, if it's some kind of a ailment that was local to an area. Now with people coming from all parts of the world, we see that the understanding would be very limited from the point of view of the Western providers. So I may be sitting here in the United States, but I don't know what is the background in a certain village in Nigeria, or a certain background, certain circumstances in a village in Syria, that I would have to have that understanding. Of course, in the absence of having an understanding of every single culture that is provided, having a framework that talks about looking at those cultural expressions on how a person may talk about their need, medical, behavioral, emotional. And that is also another paper that will come out from the study. And I talked about splitting the study into 3. So one, I will just discuss the mental health needs, which were depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and then the provider responses that correspond to that. The second paper that I'm developing is about the social and cultural issues. So what are the norms? How acceptable is smoking? How acceptable is it to be a single parent? How acceptable it is to have just kind of general ailments? I'm not feeling well, and what do we do with that? And then the third piece was that, how am I expressing my distress? Am I saying, oh, I have a problem, I am having depression, I need to see a doctor for mental health, but which is not the case. So what are the words that the women are using? Are they saying something like, yeah, I can't sleep at night, or yeah, I'm thinking a lot? So when we look at the Western instruments that are assessing health, there is no column that asks for, are you thinking a lot, for example, right? So we may miss out on certain responses from the women that are very clearly talking about a need for help in any way. And it doesn't have to be medical help. The help could be social, it could be psychosocial, it could be a help from the community. And using the cultural model, we can be open to looking at those responses. We can be open to looking at more than just one section. So using an approach which includes the biological and psychological and social and economic factors, and then using the medical anthropology framework seems like the most appropriate choice for a study such as my study, that I saw that it supported the responses that I received from the women, and it also validated the responses from the providers.
And then does that research or that study also take the women that are in North Carolina, the same group that you had worked with originally?
The first study, no. The first study that I did was women from different parts of the world. Of course, it was done about 3 years ago, and we did not have any Syrian women in that group, but there were women resettled in North Carolina from 8 different countries.
Interesting. So my final question, so if you guys have any others, please make sure to ask them now. But my final question is just if you could speak to some interventions or approaches that have successfully linked the importance of advocacy and successful forms of advocacy to true hard changes in policy outcome, where we see that kind of happening.
We hope to see a lot more of that. An example would be so how we disseminate our research or findings or results is very important. If we limit our findings to just sharing in top ranking journals, we have to understand that very few people have access or interest in sharing that. So my study might be well suited for a journal. Of course, I should go ahead and publish it. However, I should use other mediums such as this and community based events to share my findings. What it does, it also it gives a sense of openness and inclusion to persons, right? So if I'm conducting research and nobody else knows about it, if the women who participated, they don't know about what happened, you talk to us, and you sat in our homes, you had a cup of tea, you asked some questions, and then what happened, right? And then also if we have to create efforts for advocacy, we have to be inclusive. To be inclusive, we can't just keep asking questions. We have to give the answers. We have to share them in the right medium so that there's ongoing collaboration. Collaboration is not a one-time thing, in my opinion. It has to be an ongoing, and it has to have more and more partners joining, as again was given in the ecosystem map, which I really was engaged in and will use in my research going forward. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. So it really has to, be ongoing in order to not just make people feel like we just want to know these questions from you and then thanks for helping, but it's a relationship and it's continuous.
There's a live question, and can I answer it? Do we have time for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there a reason? Yes. So yes, the study was specifically for resettled women. And for this study, I did not include men. However, when I did go to the homes, men asked me the same question, and two of the men who were the husbands of the women I was interviewing were very interested in participating. And I did say to them that, look, I will do another study. For this, you're welcome to provide your answers, but I will not be able to record them and include them in the study. However, men were very open too. And I think there have to be studies that include men and women. There have to be studies that are specifically for men and women. And that was also in response to one of the gaps that I saw in literature, where responses were aggregated. So for example, there's a recent study done on Afghan refugees, and it was conducted in California. And the same question when asked to the husbands and wives was having a family connection and strong family network, was it a sense of stress relief? And the women answered in affirmative, and the men answered that it did not reduce their stress. So for example, there is a need to analyze the responses and look at them separately, because they could be different. And that doesn't mean that we could not have both men and women in the study. But for my study, I just limited it to women only. But that is a good point, and in the future, I will consider.
Great. So if that's all the questions that we have, I think we are all good. So thank you so much for such an insightful and really educational presentation. We really appreciate you and your time for coming today.
Thank you very much. It was an honor. I enjoyed very much, and thanks to all the participants.
Thank you. Okay, so guys, this will be live or recorded and be on YouTube, and we will send the link later and post the PowerPoint slides. Thank you.